to 3 minutes. As with our in-person meetings, this board meeting is being recorded and will be made available on the district website. With that, I will now call to order the February 22nd meeting of the East Penn Board of School Directors. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. First order of business is the roll call for attendance. Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Ms. Bowman?
Present.
Mr. Byrd?
Present.
Mr. Champagne?
Present.
Mr. Jankowski?
Present.
Dr. Levinson?
Present.
Dr. Munson?
Present.
Mr. Smith?
Here.
Ms. Winch?
Here.
Dr. Bacher?
Here.
All present.
Thank you. Next up is the report from the Student Government Association. We have Grace Comfort and Bella Hagney here. Please go ahead.
Good evening. I would like to start out with some student government updates. With our successful virtual Kahoot trivia game, SGA is currently working towards creating more virtual activities for the student body to enjoy at any time they would like. Some of our ideas include a virtual spirit week, a virtual escape room, and many more ideas that we are planning.
Good evening as well. The Scholastic Art and Music Awards is one of the country's most prestigious awards for students grades 7th through 12th. The winners have been announced and 19 students from the EHS community were recognized. The highest placing winners were Lindsay Ott, Mercedes Wagaman, and Sadie Kennedy. Finally, I would like to congratulate the EHS students that will be moving forward to compete in this year's Region 6 PA History Day competition. This virtual competition will be hosted by Muhlenberg College and will take place on Saturday, March 20th. Congratulations to Adam Grigorek, Heather Fabrice, Kayla Fanning, Cameron Fanning, Samantha Lewipper and Jack Fremont, Lynn Luo, Andrew Morey, Nadia Anthony and Julia McDonald, Clara Kennedy and Sadie Kennedy, along with Lauren Kushner and Pandora Schoen. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you have a nice night.
Thank you. Are there any questions for our student representatives? Then I'd like to thank you both. You're welcome to stay on for the rest of the meeting, but you're also welcome to head to other activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a nice night.
Thank you.
Night. Next on the agenda is request to address the board. I have two people that pre-registered. The first is Amanda Osher on school reopening plan.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. First, I would like to thank the board this evening for taking the time to listen. As you know, it is important to hear from all members of the school community. To begin, there is something that was said a few meetings back by Ms. Winch. It is something that I have not been able to clear from my mind, and it is brought back up each time one of my daughters comes to me with a plea for more information as to when they can go back to school. Ms. Winch had stated that she believes there was a voice that had not been heard from, and that was the voices of our teachers and staff. I must fervently disagree with that statement. I believe that that is the only voice we have been hearing from. And perhaps also the teachers' union, in which we have heard loud and clear. The voice that needs to be heard and listened to is the voice of our students. And it is my job as a parent to be the voice for my children. As a parent, it is absolutely heartbreaking to see your kids hurting so much and for them wanting to do something about it. They want people to hear them and listen to them and feel that no matter what they say or do, it doesn't matter. A direct quote that came from my daughter just today. The school board doesn't care about me or what I have to say about these issues. It is clear that they are getting the information they want from someone much more important than me, end quote. We must begin these discussions. As difficult as it may be, we must do it. We need to figure out a plan because the children of our community deserve that from each one of you. It is imperative that the board, along with the administration, set forth a clear plan with timeline as to what the return to school will look like. At this point, even if this plan only takes into account the next school year of 21-22, our families and staff deserve at least that. We must be able to plan for the next school year with as much information as possible. The fact that this has not been an action item on every board meeting is absolutely absurd. I would hope that moving forward, this is an item that is at the forefront of each meeting. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Osher. Next up is Mr. McLean, Ed McLean on opening schools full-time.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you for allowing me to speak tonight. I appreciate your time. And I would like to just continue with the agenda of opening the schools. I understand this is a very difficult decision to make, and we appreciate the step forward with hybrid schools. But if you think hybrid schools are easy for kids or teachers, it's not. We have many friends that are teachers and certainly see our kids that are challenged on a day in, day out basis with the format that you have approved at this stage. The data is clear that these kids, these teenage kids, are at little to no risk for COVID, and to use that as an excuse to keep these kids out of face-to-face is really a disgrace. The Governor, Wolf, has lifted the ban on all person extracurricular activities, and we're seeing our athletic teams, both travel and school teams, they're figuring this out. They have provided a course forward that is safe for the children and allows them to actually have fun and interact in a safe environment that is stimulated for them versus the school. The front page of the Morning Call on Sunday talks about the rally of parents in the Lehigh Valley that are just infuriated by the fact that this school district continues to make excuses about opening full-time. And when I say opening full-time, I don't say for everybody. If you don't feel safe in bringing your child to school, then you should have the right not to do so. But for those of us that want to bring our kids back to school, we understand the risk of mental health. We understand and we see what is happening to our kids on a day in and day out basis. Give us the opportunity to bring our kids back to school and stop kowtowing to all of this COVID jargon that's going out there. Look at the data that is relevant to our children. Anthony Fauci of the CDC warned that vaccinating all teachers before reopening schools is not even a viable option. I understand that several of you on the board have stated that you wouldn't even consider opening the schools full time until teachers get fully vaccinated. If the head of the CDC says it's impossible, then why is that even a thought for the school district? Many hospitals and doctors and nurses in the hospitals, local hospitals, are not getting vaccinated for their own reasons. And so I'll just end with this, and you have a responsibility as leaders. You have a lot of control over our children and over these schools. And your leadership right now is failing our kids. And the direct result of that is the mental health that is rising day to day with our children. So please, I beg you, please reconsider and figure out, like the athletic teams are doing that around the state, how to get our kids back to school safely. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. McLean. Moving on to approval of minutes, I'll entertain a motion now.
So moved, Bowman.
Second.
Berg.
Is there any discussion? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jenkins,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Winch,
Aye.
Ms. Bowman,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Next up is our preliminary budget overview for expenditures. Mrs. Campbell, would you like to start it off?
Yes, thank you. Okay, Mr. Saul and I are excited to come back and continue our budget discussions with both the board as well as our community. And specifically, our goal this evening is to provide an overview of our expenditures for 2021-22 budget. I would like to highlight that what we're sharing tonight is a general high-level summary of our expenses, our projected expenditures, I should say. And you'll note as we go through the presentation, there are several expenditures that we will revisit at the April 12th budget presentation. And you'll notice that we did insert an additional budget update for our board at that April 12th meeting. That was a regularly scheduled board meeting. We hadn't originally had it slated for budget discussions, but certainly it's a great time for some additional follow-ups, and so we have that planned for the board. A quick reminder of our philosophical approach to the upcoming budget cycle, and it really is one of restoration, specifically of educational opportunities that support our students' academic, social, and emotional needs. Specifically, we're looking at restoring building budgets, personnel, as well as programs. In this next slide, we provide the board with an overview of the costs associated with the restorations. I will note with regard to these projected costs, the teaching positions do include salary and benefits. The other point that I want to make on this slide is with regard to the Ready Math resources that are projected for approximately $220,000. There is a possibility for these resources that we will be able to use the ESSER or ESSR funds, which is basically a second round of funds for school districts to support unanticipated costs associated with COVID-19. And Mr. Saul will go into those COVID relief funds later in our presentation, but I just wanted to highlight here on the cost page that again, those funds, the COVID relief funds would be a potential funding source for our Ready Math resources for the upcoming school year. I'm now going to spend a few moments speaking to some of the specific restorations that we have planned for the upcoming school year. In particular, at the elementary level, we are adding an elementary teaching position back into the budget. As of right now, there are many uncertainties with regard to our elementary enrollments for the upcoming school year. And I'll mention this later during my superintendent's report, but one of the important factors related to our enrollment for the upcoming school year is kindergarten registration, which opens in East Penn for incoming kindergarten families March 1st, so next week. And so certainly that kindergarten enrollment period is a really important time for us in terms of making projections of the number of kindergartners that we can anticipate joining East Penn schools next year. In addition, I'll also share that we are planning sessions with families who made the decision to leave East Penn schools this year and instead opt for a cyber charter program for this year. And so we're planning sessions with those families to invite them back to our classrooms for the 21-22 school year. So as we continue to monitor both kindergarten enrollments as well as recouping any cyber charter students, we certainly thought it would be prudent to have an additional elementary teacher in the budget. And again, as we go throughout the budget cycle and have a better sense of those enrollments, as soon as we have an idea as to where and how that position might be helpful, we can certainly bring that further level of detail back to the board. At the secondary level, the additional position, the teaching position, is intended for Emmaus High School, specifically to support reading interventions. This includes, but is not limited to, the reading seminar course that our board approved this fall. And over the next 6 weeks, we will continue to review our student performance data as well as course selection information. And the secondary teaching position is the one position that we do plan to provide the board with further information regarding the specifics of that position and courses and things like that at our April meeting. Another set of positions that we're planning to restore are our summer support staff. Specifically, prior to this past summer, in East Penn, we would hire summer maintenance staff as well as summer technology staff. And these are temporary seasonal positions that would support our main maintenance or technology crews. Specifically with regard to maintenance, our seasonal positions support our maintenance crew with regard to buildings and grounds cleaning, as well as maintenance projects. You can all appreciate that with the closure of schools last March, our maintenance and students and staff not being present in buildings, our maintenance staff had the opportunity to start some of those cleaning and maintenance projects earlier than they typically would. And as a result of the need not being there last year, as well as an attempt to reduce expenditures in the last budget cycle, we eliminated those positions in the budget for this year. But again, now have the need to restore them. In addition, in terms of the summer technology staff, these are also seasonal positions that support our technology staff in terms of configuring about over 1,000 student devices, almost 700 staff devices, restoring and configuring iPads as we have students leaving the elementary level and reconfiguring those iPads for the incoming kindergartners, and then also updating our technology labs as appropriate. I also wanted to provide the board with an overview of the math resources that are included as expenditures within the upcoming budget cycle. You might recall about 3 years ago in July of 2018, the district purchased ready math resources to support our math curriculum for our students in kindergarten through 8th grade. The original purpose back in 2018 was a 3-year purchase that included professional development. And what we are now including in the budget annually is about $220,000, and that does represent 1 year of what will be a recurring cost for instructional materials. And you can see on this slide here, all of the resources that are included, again, for all students in kindergarten through 8th grade. When we talk about consumable materials, this is their usable math workbook in essence. It includes the online licenses for iReady, which has been a pivotal part of our remote program this year, as well as are regularly used as part of students in classwork as well. We also include licenses for our students who are taking Algebra 1, as well as Fundamentals of Algebra. And then there certainly are a breadth of online resources for teachers and also the student ebook. And the final anticipated expenditure that we have as part of the upcoming budget cycle is social emotional learning resources. And we're very fortunate in that we have a committee that's been working for over a year now to coordinate social emotional learning, or the acronym SEL, resources. for our students. Our initial year in East Penn focused on trauma, including identifying building needs, providing all of our staff with initial training on trauma, and ongoing coaching on the implementation of trauma-informed practices for our staff. As we look and expand our focus now to addressing social emotional learning for the 21-22 school year, our committee is in the process of investigating resources, specifically an online platform that would include a screener, as well as intervention strategies. Once we have selected those resources, a representative from our SEL committee will report back and share an overview of the final resources. Again, that's planned for that April meeting. But as of this point, the resources that we are investigating are quite robust and include both, again, a screening tool, a data warehouse in which academic as well as that SEL data could be stored, and then also intervention strategies to address a variety of components of healthy students. And now Mr. Saul is going to go into detail regarding some of the other anticipated expenditures of the budget, including first beginning with a look at wages and benefits.
Great, thank you so much. As Mrs. Campbell said, I'd like to highlight for the board the many areas of the expenditures and talk a little bit about those areas and why we're seeing, for instance, the changes that we're seeing. So I'm just going to work first through the slide on wages. First, when we look at the administration line item, what's included in there are budgeted increases at the Act 1 index, I'm sorry. And that was an early, that's what we used early in the budget process. And we need to revisit that, likely adjust that. And when Mrs. Campbell talked earlier about coming back to the board at the first board meeting in April, what I would like to do is maintain the expenditures the way they are that you will see this evening when we give you the long range plan, so that there's consistency in terms of the numbers you're seeing. And then we'd like to come back in April after you have an opportunity to review the long range plan and revise those numbers as we've done in the past, and then talk about those revisions. So just to give you an idea in terms of process of how that will work. Also, so going back to the administration line item, the percentage increase we see there is also driven by the enhancement of the HR leadership position from an HR manager to an HR director. Again, we've budgeted that position at the high end of the salary range as a placeholder. And certainly once an individual is identified and hired for that position, we will adjust that. Again, likely something that we will bring back to the board as an adjustment in early April. Other possible adjustments that we will see, actually, those are all the adjustments for the administration line item, I'm sorry. The next line item, instruction, includes the matrix enhancement of 3% for the salary guide, for the professional salary guide for next year. It also, as Mrs. Campbell indicated earlier, includes the 2 positions that are being recommended for restoration. Other possible adjustments that we will likely see moving forward are increases for column movement. We do allow column movement mid-year, and that happens late February, early March. So we'll bring those changes back to the board. But also later, you'll recall later in the budget process, we typically make adjustments for retirements. As we receive those, we'll make adjustments which could have a downward impact on that particular line item. With regard to custodial maintenance, the contractual increase in that line item is 1.8% for that group. This does include the restoration for the summer maintenance program, as described by Mrs. Campbell. And we while we put in the amount of the program that was supported in the past, we're certainly going to evaluate that and determine whether that full scale of a program is needed this summer, or if we are able to scale that back. And again, we will come back to the board with a recommendation in terms of the scope and cost of that program. In the support staff line item, this includes a multitude of people, our administrative assistants, instructional assistants, support assistants, academic support assistants, health room nurses, confidential assistants, and technology. So there are a lot of different individuals included in there, and the increases range for those various individuals and groups from 2.7% to 3.4%. As you notice, the overall percentage is lower, and that's really attributed to the turnover we've seen in those positions, as well as the elimination of an administrative assistant position in the central administration building, a position we used to have in the copy center. We've eliminated that when we engaged in our new copier contract. So when you take out that increase, you take out that position, it's driving a lower overall increase in that line item. With regard to tax collectors are paid per bill collected, almost on like a piecemeal method. You may recall earlier this year we approved the tax collector compensation arrangement for the coming years. The increase we see here is really related to three things. One is additional parcels as we see housing subdivisions being developed, and those properties are being subdivided and generating additional tax bills to be collected. Also increases in interim billings, and then finally increased utilization in terms of installment payments, because we do pay per installment collected on installments. So again, a small adjustment, but an adjustment nonetheless in terms of tax collectors. So overall, we can see that at this point, again, early in the process, the total salary increase that's being driven is just a little over 3%. On the next slide, we have benefits. And I'd like to take just a little time to work through this, and specifically the group insurances. You can see an overall little over an 11% increase in terms of group insurances. Part of what's driving that is, and we've talked about this, or it's been mentioned, I should say, at previous board meetings, the health insurance increase for next year is 10%. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. We haven't really talked a whole lot in the past about how we secure our health insurance, primarily because over the past handful of years, the renewal rates have been relatively low, as we'll see in just a minute. But we are, East Penn is part of a health benefits consortium, which includes 10 other school entities here in the Lehigh Valley, specifically in Lehigh County. And we have nearly 20 years ago, everybody came together to pool their purchasing power and negotiate favorable pricing for medical and prescription drug benefits. Collectively, at this point, the consortium has 4,250 subscribers, and we might refer to employees on the plan, which covers 11,800 lives. So as you can tell, we have significant purchasing power with those types of numbers. If we could move forward to slide 7. On slide 7, you can see the premium rates of change, or the renewal rates, we might call them, over the past 10 years. And you can see in the most recent history, the last 5 years, we've had both negative as well as relatively low renewal rates. And if you average over the past 5 years, the average is roughly 0.5%. The reason for these low renewals over the past handful of years has been a couple things. And if we could go to the next slide, I can just talk from there. one thing is the use of fund balance, and the other is a strategy at the consortium. So let me talk through that a little bit. Going back prior to the 2017-18 renewal, when the increase percentages were calculated, the Highmark book of business, their entire organization was looked at in terms of what were the trends of increasing health insurance. And that was actually driving, the number was too high, if I can put it that way. It was driving significant increases that were, the increases were contributing to the consortium's reserves, the reserve funds, similar to our fund balance, if you will. And so in 2000, the consortium trustees recognized this pattern of increasing fund balance. And so in 2017-18, there was a change made to using the consortium specific trends, meaning looking at the utilization of healthcare just within the consortium and looking at what the increased trend is in terms of cost and using the consortium specific trend, which was almost 50% of what the previous trends were that were being utilized. At the same time, the trustees, recognizing that this fund balance had grown, started a concerted effort for spending down some of the fund balance. So actually, what we have referred to in terms of our budget as deficit spending. So the combination of the lower renewal rates with the suppression of those rates for deficit spending spent down the fund balance as had been planned, and also had lower renewal rates, which is all fine, well, and good, except when you have a pandemic time that intersects with this process. So at this time last year, when the renewal was being considered, we recognized the difficult financial times. And so again, the rate was suppressed last year using a fund balance. But every time that you suppress that, the following year, you really have to make up for that. And so, we renewed at, give me 1 second. We renewed at a little over 3%. Really, what was being driven was more like 8%. The rate was suppressed. The result of that was a higher demand or a higher renewal rate in the current for next year, meaning the renewal rate that's being driven actually is close to 14% with some of the experience that was incurred. So the demand in terms of calculating the renewal rate for health insurance next year is really 14%. But again, recognizing the difficult times, there's some suppression being used to 10% and using some additional fund balance. We have an advisor that we work with who closely monitors this with the trustees, and we project that will take us down to 2 months of operating expenses, if you will, which is actually a reasonable number in terms of operating a healthcare consortium or healthcare trust like this. And so I guess looking forward, because of that slight suppression this year, at this point, we're anticipating renewal rates to be roughly 10% again next year. So I wanted to give the board this overview because we don't often talk about, as I said, the consortium. Hopefully, I tried to keep it as simple as possible. When we get to the end, if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer those. But really, a 10% increase is what's being adopted for next year, for the coming year. And then keep in mind that based on trends and the activity, a 10% increase for the following year is likely. The end game, or the ultimate goal of the trustees, is to get ourselves leveled out at a fair, at a reasonable fund balance, if you will, a reserve fund balance, and then begin budgeting each year or renewing at that trend number of just a little over 5%, so that it's consistent each year at 5%, year over year. That, some years you would have better experience, and so the fund balance would grow a little bit, and other years the experience may not be as good and you would spend down the fund balance. But in theory, if you budget that trend number year over year, it averages out over the long term. So that's sort of the end game for the consortium trustee, in terms of the plan the trustees have put together. Okay, I think I hit all the points on that. I just want to talk a little bit more before I get to this benefit slide about the group insurances. The other thing that was driving some of the increase in the group insurances is a projected increase in the life insurance line item due to some additional benefits that were new life insurance benefit afforded to our support professional group in their collective bargaining agreement. The next line on the schedule that we were looking at earlier was Social Security. I just wanted to mention that in the Social Security line item, the rate remains the same for next year in terms of the Social Security rate. And therefore, if you look at the percentage, it really is equivalent to our wage increase percentage because of the Social Security being driven by wages. In terms of retirement contributions, we've seen this chart in the past. This is the 20-year history of retirement contribution rates. The increase from 2021, the current year, to the year we're looking at in terms of budget is 1.5%. So when we look at that retirement line item, it's a little over 4%. So if we take the 3% overall wage increase plus the 1.25% retirement increase, it's driving a little over 4% increase in the retirement contribution. And then finally, again on the chart that was the benefits chart, the last item was workers' compensation. The percentage for that was 10%. Again, an early budget number is recommended by our insurance advisors. In our early talks with our incumbent workers' compensation provider, is that the sort of the underlying rate will not go up, but if workers' compensation premium is actually driven by the underlying rate, as well as your wages, as well as an experience modifier. And our wages obviously will go up, and because of some of our experience modifier will go up a little bit. So certainly, while the underlying rate may remain the same, we can anticipate a small increase in workers' compensation. That's an item that typically we revisit later in the year, usually in April or May, because we've completed the renewal process and we know what our renewal rates will be. So that gets us through the benefits section of the budget. In terms of the other services, the building and department budgets, Mrs. Campbell discussed earlier in terms of restoring those items to their prior level. Under the federal grants line item, you can see that this is a reduction. This really recognizes the removal of the CARES ESSER-1 funds that we budgeted for the current year. We have not yet put into the budget the CARES or CARISA ESSER-2 funds, and we'll talk about those in just a little bit, sort of separately. In terms of cyber and charter tuition, I did want to share the graph on the next slide, which gives a visual representation of our recent experience in terms of charter cyber tuition. You can see that, the years between 15-16 and 19-20, there was just sort of a natural increase. Cyber charter tuition is based off the school district's budgeted expenses. So as our expenses increase, naturally there's an increase in the tuition rate. So I think as you look at that, the number of students enrolled likely remained very static, but it was really the tuition rate that was driving some of the increase over those years. You can see our budget for the current year fell in line with that. But our projection, based on our current enrollments, is certainly much higher. And then looking forward to the budget for next year, again, is much higher. I would have to say that, in my opinion, this is probably one of the largest unknown variables in our budget. Certainly, I would anticipate that those students who are driving the increase in the current year projected, there's the question, well, they went from our regular program, likely because of the coronavirus, and went to we know that's the increase was in cyber enrollments. So the question is, will they come back to the school district next year, thereby lowering the tuition expenditures, or will they remain another year or beyond? Again, making it difficult to project. And so my thought on this is certainly it's better to project at the higher number at this point. As Mrs. Campbell has referenced, there's going to be some efforts to attract those students back to the school district. So perhaps after those efforts, we may have a better idea in terms of how to project this, in a downward direction for the future. I'll just, you can see at the bottom, but I'll just comment. We report, if we could just go back to that previous slide. Most of our tracking with regard to cyber charter and cyber charter students is to the state is based on special education or regular education. So you can see we've just given you the breakout here with regard to those, the two classifications of students. The one other thing I wanted to mention is there was a question submitted with regard to the breakdown of students in brick and mortar charter versus cyber charter. And in those years, 15, 16 through 19, 20, the ratio was really 2 to 1, 2 students in brick and mortar for every 1 student in a cyber charter. Currently, it's really a 1 to 1. 50% of our students in cyber charters are in brick and mortar, and the other 50% are in cyber charters. So that's the change that we have seen this year is an increase in the cyber charter enrollment. Thank you. The next item is the Lcti tuition. Obviously, this is driven by directly by the Lcti budget, which is, I believe, on the agenda for adoption this evening. And so we take that directly from that. I think the one that's on the agenda this evening may actually be tweaked slightly from these numbers, which were from a previous iteration of the Lcti budget. Again, that will certainly be updated for the board in April. Pupil transportation, the increase of 2.5% is reflective of our contract for pupil transportation, which has an annual increase of 2.5%. The miscellaneous services really grabs everything that's not included or itemized on this chart, and really just for accounting purposes and tying out the numbers, you can just see a small, almost like miscellaneous difference there. With regard to debt service, there is a slide on slide 12. Oh, no, the numbers are different. I apologize. There is a slide, I think it's 2 after this one. There it is. Yes, thank you. Again, the board has seen this in the past. It does certainly look different this year than it did in the past because of some activities, because of our refinance activities last spring. But this, just as a reminder to the board, the bar represents the total payment that the district makes for principal and interest. The yellow part represents the reimbursement that we receive from the Commonwealth, and therefore the green is the net expense for the school district. As I mentioned, and hopefully you'll recall, last spring, we did take advantage of favorable markets and refinance some bonds that were callable. And at the same time, we restructured and established this this declining slope of sort of a step down every year. Previously, you may recall that we had sort of 2 years at the same level and then a step down, 2 years and a step down. So this does offer potentially budget relief if needed each year. You'll recall, pardon me, let me just grab a drink of water. Thank you. You'll recall in years past, we've talked about and advocate for a strategy of, as debt service reduces, transferring that to a contribution to capital reserve for the purpose of funding our ongoing capital projects programs, as well as preparing for any major infrastructure needs that we may have in the future. Specifically, we're engaging in the facility study, and so certainly that will tell us more specifically what we need to plan for in the future. But at least for now, while we're waiting to complete that, we continue to advocate this strategy of shifting from debt service to capital reserve transfer, so that if we had a major capital need that required the issuance of debt, we certainly could shift that back from capital reserve transfer back to the payment of debt line item. There is I did include a chart for the board that shows the recommended strategy. And really, if you look at the chart on the capital reserve transfer, it has an inverse relationship to the debt service, because really it's as one goes up, the other one goes down. The final line item on here is the budgetary reserve line item. That was increased simply for the purpose of maintaining a budgetary reserve that is 5% of the total budget. I'll remind the board that when we look at our long-term plan and the way we look at our finances, we back out the budgetary reserve at the bottom line. So while this is an increase, when we back it out, it really has a net effect of 0 on the budget. So you could double this and it really wouldn't change the bottom line. So really that's just to maintain the 5% as we've done in the past. Moving forward, that really gets us through the the high level overview of the budget expenditures. We also wanted to talk a little bit about the Sr2 funds and give the board some information related to these funds. As we mentioned earlier, the Sr2 funds have not been incorporated into the budget yet. When they are incorporated, they likely will have a net effect of 0, because when we add expenditures, we will add the corresponding revenue line item for grant revenue. As a reminder, both the Pennsylvania Department of Education and the Education Secretary, in releasing these funds and the fund announcement, have reminded us that these are non-recurring emergency aid. And I think that non-recurring piece is very important. In 2010, there was the federal stimulus, the ARRA stimulus funds were distributed, and they were non-recurring funds, but many school districts used them in a recurring, to cover recurring expenditures, and then later found themselves in challenging times trying to figure out how to get out from and under using those for recurring expenditures. So as we plan for these use of these funds, we are trying to be very mindful of using them in a way that is not going to get us into a situation in the future where we can't figure out how to continue whatever it is that we're spending the funds on. The funds can be used dating back actually to March 13th, 2020, and the grant period extends through September 30th of 2023. So from that actually gives us the ability to spend these funds both in the year that we're developing the budget, 21-22, as well as the following year, 22-23. And I think as we look at these funds, we're certainly trying to plan on using those over 2 years for things like, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but for things like, remediation programs, et cetera. There was a question submitted about how we access these funds. These funds will be distributed from the federal government to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, will be distributed through the Pennsylvania Department of Education's Department of Federal Programs, very similar to the title funds that we receive, Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV. There is an application and review process. The application is then approved and a grant award is issued. And then, there's ongoing reporting requirements to the Pennsylvania Department of Education through their online portal. The preliminary allocation of funds for ESSER 2 is just a little over $2.7 million. The Department of Education did stress that this number is preliminary. There's a blurb at the bottom of the slide that talks in some detail about why that is. They have suggested that the amount will be updated in February. We have not seen the update yet. We continue to watch for that, and obviously as soon as that is that revision is known, we'll make adjustments accordingly. On the next slide, which I believe is our last slide, we have started internal discussions about what are appropriate uses of these funds, how will they have the greatest impact, and how will they really serve the intent of the grant. The intent of these funds, we believe, was to address extraordinary expenses related to the COVID pandemic, as well as address response to the conditions that were caused by the pandemic. And if you read the allowable uses, many of them say things like to purchase technology for remote programs in response to the pandemic. So a lot of it is driven by that, and we're trying to evaluate ways to use these funds that honor the intent of that. We will provide for the board the listing of allowable uses. We will provide that to you, so you have the opportunity to look at that. We did not include it in the presentation since it's lengthy. So these are some of the early ideas that we've had. As we said, we continue to discuss internally, but we are looking at remediation programs. We talked about that a little bit in the past. We've talked about transportation to make those remediation programs more convenient for our students. We've talked about learning resources, specifically Ready Math resources, and we continue to have internal discussions about appropriate ways to use these funds. And as I mentioned earlier, not get ourselves into a situation where we're using them for recurring or ongoing costs. So I think with that gets us through the expenditure program, and certainly we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
I see there are some. Dr. Leather.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. And thank you to Mrs. Campbell and Mr. Saul for the thorough overview of expenditures, projected expenditures increases for the next year. Certainly, there are a lot of areas that you've made some good assumptions trying to estimate things on the higher end, and clearly, as we know through the budget process, as the situation becomes clearer, many of these numbers are going to adjust and hopefully adjust down to help make the budget more tenable. I do have one general question regarding the I guess the early on, I forget what they called the category, but it was the budget restoration areas. Clearly all these have very good justifications, and again, trying to return us back to something, where we were before the pandemic, and then also to integrate some things that we need. Yeah, I guess just for completeness, and again, I think they're all worthy. Has there been any thought as to maybe how to prioritize these additions going back into the budget? Is that something that you're thinking about or put some thought into?
I would say what we've brought to you, which totals about $1.6 million in restorations. We see those as already a prioritized list.
Correct.
All very critical. Having conversations about restoration of departments and building budgets, I will, as a reminder, share with the board for the current budget cycle for 2020, 2021, we made about a 10% reduction overall to our building and department budgets. And so that resulted in a variety of, in some cases in the building level, instructional resources for students and teachers. In other cases, when we looked at the impact in terms of if we had to make further reductions to maintenance, it would result in some of our capital equipment replacements not being able to be done. So certainly restoring those budgets is a priority. I will also point out with regard to the math resources, those resources are an integral part of our math program, and therefore it is essential that we continue to have those resources available to teachers and students. Equally, when we talk about the importance of not only the academic needs of our students, but social emotional learning is equally, potentially, when we think about supporting our students through a pandemic, perhaps even more important right now. And then clearly as well, I think, for the secondary teaching position, we plan to bring back more detail with regard to how that position will be used, and talked about the elementary teaching position really being there as what we believe is a prudent placeholder in the event that elementary enrollment shifts. And so it's really tough for us right now with what I believe is already a somewhat lean and small list to have to prioritize that even more. But it certainly is going to be programs and people who are working with our kids.
Thank you. I mean, I anticipated that would be the answer. And as I mentioned, and even asking the question, I understand that these are all things that, are important. So, I appreciate the response. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levison. Ms. Winch?
Hi, thank you so much, Mr. Saul and Ms. Campbell. I just have a couple of questions. When we are talking about the math, we already have the Ready Math program, and I thought we were just talking about it in the beginning of the presentation as it being an annual cost. And so then to have it seen at the end where it would be in the non-reoccurring monies, it seems like it's against your rules of budgeting. And so I'm just kind of curious how you got to that decision.
Sure, absolutely. Oh, I'll take this one.
Thank you.
As Mrs. Campbell said, when we initially purchased the program, if you will, 3 years ago, the initial purchase included the consumables and licenses for the first 3-year period. That 3-year period ends. This is the final year. And you're right. I mean, it is sort of counter to what we're saying. However, because it's sort of a new expense, you're really just deferring that a few years. And again, if you manage that, right, it's either a new expense this year or we use grant funds for 2 years and it's a new expense. And you're right, it is a recurring expense. But we feel that if we're limiting that to something like the $200,000 consumables, we're not putting ourselves in a position to as if we were using all 2 million, if that makes sense. So if we said, okay, well, we're going to use $1 million a year for salaries for the next 2 years, that gets us in a very difficult position. Where if we're just using that limited piece, we don't feel that that's going to be as painful, if that makes sense.
I think the other piece that I'll just add to Mr. Saul's recollection is that the math resources are a fixed cost that we can then appropriately budget in future years moving forward. And so we know what the cost to purchase those resources will be. And again, had recognized that it's potentially one small portion of the grant funds aligned with the grant allowances, and one, again, that we can then project that in future years would need to budget for that cost.
Okay. The other, I just had a question on the academic and SEL data. How do we store it now? I'm just curious on that. And then we are looking for screeners, which I think is probably pretty crucial right now when we're looking at the state of mental health for our kiddos. You didn't list anything that jogged me as mental health, as to be able to identify kids that might need therapeutic services by communities in schools or another service. And I was just curious if the screeners that you were potentially looking at would have some mental health screening components. I kind of looked at some of those healthy things as more of executive skills.
In response to your first question about data warehouse or data storage, we do currently have a tool, and so in which we can store student assessment data. And I will share as well, the SEL program is the one expenditure that I really attempted to highlight, that we do have our committee coming back to provide you more insight once those final decisions are made. And one component that they will potentially talk about is there is one resource that we are potentially looking to purchase that we have a tool that it would replace. So there is, in essence, we would drop off in terms of one program that we currently have that's not an SEL program, but it's actually a data warehouse tool that we have but are not using to its full capacity. And so that would be some added cost there. And this, what we're looking at, is a much more robust tool. And so you are accurate when we talked about a screener. We don't currently have a screener for social emotional learning. And again, our team, when they come back in April, would actually, once they've actually identified the potential program that we are proposing, I can certainly go into a much more robust explanation for you. I will give you some insight. One program that we're strongly considering at this point has done a nice job mapping SEL and sort of overlaying it with East Penn's Portrait of a Graduate, as well as our work with equity. And so I think you'll see when we bring you that further program recommendations, some nice overlap between multiple programs in the organization, and that SEL is not just one more standalone.
And I want to say that the recommendation, the remediation programs for the one-time monies sounds like a fabulous use of those monies. And this is slightly off topic, but I gave Bob or Mr. Soul heads up that I was going to say that I was going to ask this question. The governor's budget is currently including a cyber charter tuition reform, which could lead to some pretty significant savings in the district. If that budget were to pass, what kind of relief would we see here in the district roughly?
Sure. The PDE has estimated the savings, and so this number is reported by PDE, not calculated by us, but PDE estimates our savings to be $742,000, so a little under $750,000.
Thank you so much, Bob, and Mr. Stoll, and that's all the questions I have today. Thank you so much for your great.
Thank you, Ms. Winch. Mr. Byrd?
Yes, I just have a couple of comments. I appreciate that the administration is looking at recruiting our students that gone to charter schools and cyber charter schools going into the year. I guess my question is, in moving forward, are we looking at maybe looking at a cyber charter school for East Penn? Would that have any saving costs or have any advantage?
Bob, do you want to speak to the cost differential just between our VESPA program and potentially other cyber charter costs?
Sure. So, Mr. Byrd, we do have, we offer, as you may recall, the VESPA program, which is an online alternative that we offer for our students. In some regard, to attract them either from going to a cyber charter school or and attract them back. The cost of our program is roughly $4,500 per student versus in excess of $10,000 or $12,000 for cyber charter tuition for a regular ed student, and nearly double that for a special ed student.
Okay. I guess the situation that I'm looking at, if you look at the numbers, we seem to be moving more students leaving the district. How can we prevent them or making East Penn the only choice? I know we're looking at recruiting some to coming back. How do we make them stay or they can make the only choice at East Penn School? Is that some program do we have for that?
There's no way that you legally we can't force them to stay in our program. I guess certainly trying to attract them back and make our program so attractive that they'll come back certainly would be the end game. But yeah, there's no legal way. If a student decides to go to a charter school or a cyber charter school, that is their choice, and they can do that. And we cannot prevent that.
That wasn't what I meant in my comment. My comment
Okay.
is I think when the choice is made to leave our school district, there must be something awry or something we need to attend to. And I think maybe we need a program that looks into that. I understand we can't stop anybody, but I think we can have a program or a school district that the only choice with East Penn School District. And I think that's where we can do some work in that area. I'd like to see something, and as we move forward to do that, because there's definitely a cost saving that you talked about. There's about a $12,000 for regular students and $24,000 for special ed students. So we've had more people, in fact, a lot of students special ed. If we could reduce that amount, and maybe our special ed program would be so highly regarded that the choice would be East Penn, we would be in a better situation financially. And I think that's something we should really take a hard look at. I know it can't be done right away, but I think moving.
I think we lost just the end of your comments, Mr. Byrd. If you want to. Oh, thank you, Mr. Byrd. Moving on to Ms. Bowman.
Thank you. Actually, I had, I guess, a comment about the same thing. We do have VESPA, but it would be good to know why people are not choosing that. I have some thoughts about that, but I don't want to. I don't think this is the place for me to share my suspicions. But like if we could survey families and understand why they're making these other choices so that we can intentionally look at VESPA and figure out what do we need to improve there. I think this is very important as we come to the end of the pandemic, hopefully. At some point, we'll be switching to in-person learning as the regular course of things and deciding not to have virtual as one of our options. And when we do that, we may lose a group of students who actually were thriving in our East Penn virtual program, or we run the risk of that. And if we don't have another option for them, we lose even more students to cyber charters. So I echo Mr. Bird that if you think very long-term about our problems with cyber charters, we may be able to, initially, obviously it would cost more, but long-term have a cost savings by not losing so many students to these programs that are overpriced. And other than that, I did have a couple of just small questions. You had mentioned restorations of 2 teaching positions, but that means we're still down. Are we still down 4? We lost 6 to attrition, is that right?
Yes, we did. We were down, we reduced 6 positions in last year's budget cycle.
Okay, so
So
it'll
3 and 4 secondary. Again, as you recall as well, the 4 secondary was also as a result of shifting to a block schedule.
Okay, thank you. But that's actually shows that this was already a prioritized list, then that only 2 are going back in at the moment. And then I was just I was a little confused when you had the grants under expenditures as opposed to under the next. I can't remember when we'll see the budget about the income coming in. What is the reasoning for that?
Yeah, actually, grants will show up in both places,
Okay.
because you have grant revenue coming in and you have the related expenditures going out. So they actually show up in both places.
Oh, so this one's just showing what you plan to spend the grant money on. Is that how I should read those numbers?
Where you see the negative number related to grants, what that means is in the 2021 budget, the current year, we included the CARES grant monies, both as a revenue and expenditure.
Okay.
We've removed those. That's why you see the decrease for next year. And you'll see a decrease on the revenue side related to grants as well.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I wasn't completely sure if I was following something that you said, and I just want to go back to it. Could you go to the slide that had the different personnel groups with the percent increases? Some of those percent increases were salary and some were positions being added in.
Yeah, slide 8.
Okay, and I think you mentioned administration. Part of this is I'm sorry, I have 2 unruly animals over here. The HR director position, but it seems like the percent change is a lot higher than the others that also have positions coming into them. And I think you mentioned what that was about, but I must have missed it.
Yeah, the other thing that was driving that higher percentage was in the early budget, which we continue to use until we revise it. We use the Act 1 index as the percent increase. And so we'll certainly adjust that, and that will change this number. But actually, if you take out the additional for the HR position, it actually gets it down like a 3% number. It actually looks much more reasonable.
Oh, okay. If this is just a situation where it's an oddity, then okay. Thank you so much. That's all I.
Thank you, Ms. Bowman. Mr. Smith?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Saul and Mrs. Campbell, for the presentation here. I had thought of something just popped up as Mr. Sull, you were explaining slide 18 with the SR2 planning. I had a quick question and a thought that was related to that. Do you happen to know, is there a date or a rough timeline when we have to commit to what we are going to use those funds for?
The timeline is really driven by when we want to use them, because obviously we need to have the grant application approved, so that we know that what we're submitting it for is permissible and approved. So as an example, if we want to initiate a remediation program as early as this summer, we would obviously need to have our budget done and the paperwork submitted. So really it's the timeline is driven by our own timeline of when we want to start whatever it is we're going to do with those, if that makes sense.
It does. And that actually brings me to my thought. As we're on slide 18, you had 3 just general ballpark ideas of what you might end up using the funds for. In the Department of Ed report that was just released, the COVID-19 handbook, about a week ago, they mentioned that there's going to be a volume 2 coming up, and I know that the team, the administrative team, is not short of ideas on what to use the funds for, but there was a list of 11 topics that they plan to address in that upcoming report. I thought that might be a good place to start. So the reason why I was asking was I didn't want us to commit to anything if there was a chance that in the future report, and the public can have input on that all the way through to March 15th. So I would imagine hopefully by the end of the school year, we'll see volume 2. So I was hoping that we could use that to provide us some additional guidance into how we go about using those funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Jankowski.
Again, thank you, Ms. Campbell and Mr. Saul for this report. I think the information is very, very helpful, particularly how you lay it out. My first question relates to the group insurances, and around the reserve fund balance. What is our contribution? How is our contribution to that balance determined?
Yeah, so the balance it's a pooled balance, obviously shared between the members. The way that balance comes about is we have a retrospective credit arrangement. That's what our arrangement is called with Highmark. What that means is we are a fully insured plan, but at the end of the plan year, any funds that weren't used, Highmark will place into a reserve fund and hold those. They're actually held by Highmark. So the spend down strategy we went through, and I'm maybe getting off topic a little bit, but I think it's important. The spend down strategy we went through had to be approved by Highmark because of the way our contract is structured and the fact that they hold those funds through this retrospective arrangement. So I forget what our trust document says in terms of if somebody wanted to leave, whether you have to leave everything and just walk away, or if you get a portion of that. But I think that was your question, is what portion of that is ours? And I would have to go back and just revisit the trust document to figure out, because really as part of the consortium, those resources are pooled for the benefit of the consortium.
And my question is, I mean, as you noted, the cost of insurance is increasing. Particularly, when you look at what the average annual rate of change was for the prior years to now, I mean, my understanding is that across all insurance industries, one of the drivers is obviously COVID, and corresponding to pretty good rapid increases in the cost of insurance, and that may be something that we see going forward. I mean, this as a result of what the past year and a half has experienced, this may be a cost that doesn't come down. And will this have a corresponding increase to our costs to the, to the consortium, or is it, as in an effort to buy down the cost of insurance? Could we potentially see an additional rate increase as a member of the consortium to try to drive down costs?
I think certainly if the effects of COVID drive sort of broad increases in the in the medical industry and obviously trickling over to the insurance, being paid by insurance, then yeah, I think if the entire if the cost of everything goes up, then yes, I think that'll have an impact. I do think that by looking at our own experience, we're really looking at what is being utilized by the lives that we cover, if that makes sense. So the first piece you talked about is that overall cost increase. We can't control that. That's out of our control, and so yeah, that would have an effect. But as I said, by looking at our own experience, that does at least help. What that helps us do is not build more reserves moving forward.
And that's where I was going, that word. Okay.
Yeah.
And then back, with respect to the ESSER funds, kind of, build off what Mr. Smith had asked. So our allocation, is that, just so I'm clear, is that the allocation that's available to us, provided we can support the use of those funds with our grant application?
Correct. And I think we will be able to support, there's some broad allowances in the allowable uses, if that makes sense. And so I think we'll be able to, obviously, to support those expenditures. But it's just really being strategic about that. And as I said earlier, honoring the intent of those funds in terms of first trying to respond to, the challenges that COVID has sent our way.
And that was my question. Are we able to identify expenses that we can use those funds for that are not recurring expenses, that are one-time expenses? Is there enough out there for us to find ways to use that money so that it doesn't come back and bite us in future years for recurring expenses?
Yeah, we'll certainly try. That you sort of hit the nail on the head, as they say, in terms of the challenge, especially when this is a significant amount of money to figure out. The first round of funds was a quarter of this amount, but was a little more restrictive in how you could spend it, and so that was challenging. That was, we're trying to spend that on cleaning supplies, and you can only buy so many cleaning supplies, But again, they gave us a few more options in terms of how to use these funds. So I think we will use. We're not going to. I can tell you this: we're not going to turn federal funds back in. So we will find some way to use these funds in a meaningful way.
Thank you. I look forward to. Thank you again for this presentation. I look forward to hearing your future presentations and how you're further able to cut some of these expenses. So thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Jankowski. Mr. Champagne?
Yes, thank you both for this presentation, Ms. Campbell and Mr. Saul. Just one quick question on the SEL resources. When you say intervention strategies, how will that be handled and who will be handling that? Is that with existing staff or is that outside resources? It's more for my own education in terms of how that's implemented.
Yeah, ideally, we would be looking at how they can be incorporated as part of our regular classroom instruction. And so certainly we would be looking at existing staff to be able to, again, once we've identified needs, then to be able to deliver those interventions, whether it's through, we can certainly look at our classroom teachers. We could look at our guidance counselors. Again, interventions can be delivered, as you know, in small groups, one-on-one, depending on the level of need.
Okay, thank you. And then would the SEL resources themselves, I'm not knowing exactly what you're purchasing, would those, because of the mental health considerations of the pandemic and so forth, would those potentially qualify for some of the money? And is this a one-time purchase, or is this a recurring cost? How does that look?
Yeah, the initial, great question, and that's certainly something that we can consider as well. I will say it is possible that the initial cost might be greater than a recurring cost, but certainly it is a program that, and again, I don't mean to answer vaguely, but I think once we have a final program recommendation from a committee, that will certainly bring things into a much greater focus for us. But certainly we recognize that when we talk about a screening tool and then interventions to support students, it's not just a one-year process, but we want those resources to be continually available. So I anticipate that there would be an initial cost and then certainly recurring annual fees associated with program maintenance.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Champagne. And thank you both, Mrs. Campbell and Mr. Saul, for your excellent report on expenditures, update on the budget, and looking forward to the following presentations in coming meetings. Moving on to our district update. Mrs. Campbell, back to you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to start off with the shift calendar, because Mother Nature has not been kind to us lately. And so I certainly appreciate and empathize with in particular, with all of our families, but I certainly recognize that there is currently disparity between the number of days that our hybrid A students have had and that our hybrid B students have had. And I will say those differences have grown and then leveled out a little bit over the past 2 weeks as we've continued to deal with difficult weather conditions. And so, as we previously noted, our administration continues to monitor our shift calendar. And what we would like to do, we're sort of optimistic in saying we're getting near to the end of difficult weather, winter weather that potentially causes us to make adjustments to our school calendar. So what we would hope to do is make adjustments to our shift calendar and provide our families with an updated calendar. As of now, we are tentatively looking at adjusting those days in our April shift calendar, and that really has to do with looking at the March calendar as of right now does not leave us with many Wednesdays when we could potentially shift it to an additional B day. So we're looking at making those changes potentially again in our April calendar, but I really just wanted to reach out to our families and let you know that we hear you, we understand, and are working to have a plan to create greater equity in the number of days that our different shifts are in with us for in-person instruction. A few other general announcements that I'd like to share. In particular, I mentioned this before, but this is a final reminder that our mental health symposium began on Monday, February 15th. So it was initially released last Monday. It's a virtual format this year, and there are a variety of virtual pre-recorded presentations that parents can access right from our symposium website. The great thing is we as parents can view those resources asynchronously on a variety of mental health topics, and those presentations will be available through the end of the month, through February 28th. If you haven't checked out the sessions, I strongly encourage our parents to do so. There are a variety of topics that are very relevant for families right now, including managing anxiety in children, how to work with adolescents during COVID-19, adolescent sleep and well-being, and having those difficult conversations with children about suicide. Our parents also have the opportunity to attend live panel sessions that occur nightly this week, Monday the 22nd through February the 25th. So again, just a final reminder to please check out some really awesome resources for our families. And I just wanted to take a moment to also give a special recognition to our co-chairs of the symposium, Lisa Shervinsky, Stephanie Signorella, and Amy Williams, who have just done a phenomenal job really collating all those resources for us. At the high school level, applications for LCTI for the 2021-22 school year are now available. So we encourage parents and students to check out our high school counseling page. And there is a direct link to the LCTI application there. And as a reminder, applications are due by March 3rd. As I previously mentioned, kindergarten registration for the 21-22 school year is again an online process for our families, and that goes live next week, March 1st, 2021. So please, if we have families out there with an incoming kindergarten student who is will be 5 for next school year, and or you have a family neighbor who you know has a young child who's eligible for kindergarten, please encourage them to check out our kindergarten registration. And then one final another reminder as well, in terms of our senior sign sale for our Emmaus High School class of 2021 is now up and running. That's sponsored by our foundation. The sale ends May 7th so that our signs can be delivered the week of May 17th. So don't forget to recognize your graduates as well. And I will, I have one other very important update that I'd like to share as well, and really share some information with the board as well as the community, just in terms of East Penn's ongoing planning with regard to our instructional models. And some of this information is a reiteration of what we shared with our community late last week. And certainly, there may be questions from the board and some other level of detail that we'd like to share with the community as well as part of our ongoing process. So to begin, as we look to the spring, our district is considering the feasibility of a return to a full 5-day in-person instructional model. And I think it's really important that I articulate again that there are a variety of factors that must be considered as part of the decision as to what extent we can offer 5-day in-person instruction in East Penn. And I mean this in a very sincere way in that we share these factors, I share these factors with the community, not as an excuse, not as a reason why something can't happen, but really to just be transparent with our community, with the obstacles that we absolutely have to solve or mitigate in order to return more students to our building safely. So some of those, and again, obstacles are just that. We recognize that there are solutions, and we are certainly committed to working with stakeholders on those solutions, but some are certainly more complex than others. One of the first factors that we have to consider is the level of community spread that is really based on COVID case data. Connected to that is the instructional model recommendations that are that come from PDE, and probably more importantly, are also outlined in our health and safety plan. And I'll just remind the public that as of right now, we have a board-approved health and safety plan that was brought forth by our task force that in the substantial level of spread includes hybrid instruction as well as remote instruction. I will also say that same plan at the moderate level of spread. So in the event that our COVID cases continue to decrease in the community and we look at that positivity, the PCR rate, as well as the incident rate, as we continue to monitor those factors, in the event that Lehigh County, drop to the moderate level of spread, our current health and safety plan, again, calls for either a hybrid instructional model or a remote instructional model. So there is certainly some decisions that would have to be made in terms of our health and safety plan, in terms of bringing forth a recommendation for any changes there. I want to also point out that East Penn, like all public school districts, signed an attestation form in which districts agree that if we bring students in for in-person instruction in substantial level of spread, the district has assured the state that we will follow certain requirements, including the mask order, and also that we will adhere to those social distancing guidelines, including situations in which our students are eating in the cafeteria, and obviously in those cases have to be unmasked. So at this moment, just with regard to the attestation process, I am going to ask our solicitor to just give a very brief legal perspective on that attestation process. Again, just because this is something that we haven't necessarily discussed in detail in public, and I think it's important just for the public to understand some of these intricate factors that really impact how and when we move forward.
So thank you, Mrs. Campbell. And as a reminder to the board and for the public's knowledge, I want to take everybody back until to November of 2020. On November 23rd of 2020, the Department of Health issued an order that essentially stated that for all school districts that were in substantial level of transmission for 2 consecutive weeks, if you wanted to continue any form of in-person instruction, you had to submit an attestation form to the Department of Health on or before November 30 of 2020. And that attestation form had to be signed by the board president as well as the superintendent of schools. As Mrs. Campbell indicated, there were 2 particular items that had to be attested to. Number 1, that the school districts in substantial spread had to follow the identification of cases for COVID-19. And secondly, that school districts had to follow the updated order of the Secretary of the Department of Health requiring universal face coverings, including any necessary exceptions, as well as the associated guidance. East Penn School District agreed to execute that attestation and did so in a timely manner. So that allowed for in-person instruction to continue after November the 30th. With respect to those 2 items, the first, as I said, was that the school district had to agree to follow the protocols for the identification of COVID-19 cases. That has not been an issue, and the school district has been following that. And I think if you'll recall to the last board meeting, there was a lengthy discussion of the practice the school district has been following. The other requirement that the school district attested to was that all students and staff, unless they qualify for an exception, are required to wear a face covering. And there were 3 general exceptions. Number 1, if they were eating or drinking, provided they were spaced apart at least 6 feet from one another. Secondly, there was an exception if you wore a face covering and that created an unsafe condition in which to either operate equipment or to execute a task. And then thirdly, there was an exception that provided that you could be at least, if you were at least 6 feet apart during what was considered a quote face covering break which could last no more than 10 minutes. So as you as a school district decide to consider whether or not you are going to return to a 5-day in-person instruction, it is critically important that the administration is going to have to examine the increased potential number of students in school buildings to see if you're going to be able to comply with the 6-foot requirement in classrooms, as well as in the lunchroom, as well as during these face covering breaks. I also want to make certain that you're aware of PDE's role vis-a-vis compliance with the attestation. I am aware that PDE is now investigating complaints of alleged violations by school districts in terms of not following the attestation process. And they appear willing to be imposing sanctions on school districts if they are not following, and in particular, the masking requirement. And if PDE finds that you as a school district are not complying with the mask requirement, they are going to make you, whether you like it or not, and whether the public likes it or not, they are going to make you move to full remote instruction for all students. In addition, they also will now essentially suspend all extracurricular activities as well. Extracurricular activities, as we know, include athletics, clubs, student councils, you name it. All of those will be suspended as well. So it's critically important as you consider going to 5-day instruction that you can comply with the requirements, especially for the universal face masking. The last thing that you want to do as a school district is make that decision, move completely forward to 5-day instruction, find yourselves in violation, and now you've gone 360 degrees in reverse and you're stuck in full remote instruction. So please, I suggest that the administration look very, very carefully as to whether or not that can be accomplished before proceeding any further.
So again, I think I recognize that the attestation process is something that we've talked about generally, but we didn't necessarily go into that level of detail. And really just want to be as transparent and open as possible in terms of the considerations that we need to look at. And another piece that really continues, that is certainly a factor that we have to continue to investigate is the 6-foot social distancing to which East Penn has committed as part of its health and safety plan. And again, Mr. Fisher referenced the social distancing before, but I will point out that this is something that may be what makes school districts different from each other, in that East Penn explicitly states in our health and safety plan that we will provide 6-foot social distancing in classrooms, as well as when our students, if, for example, at the secondary level, they go to the cafeteria for lunch. So we are obligated to provide the 6-foot social distancing there. At the elementary level, our students have their lunch in their classrooms. Again, that is a difference in that I know that there are other organizations in which social distancing may be defined a bit differently in terms of 3 to 6 feet. And so those are just organizational differences and decisions that have been made, but it certainly is something that for now is a key consideration for our organization in terms of the number of students that we can safely bring back to our schools. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about classroom capacities related to 6-foot social distancing in a moment, but I did also want to address that when we talk about social distancing in our health and safety plan, I know that we have had some conversations as well, just in terms of staffing considerations and accommodations for all staff members, depending on specific personal medical situations or needs. And so at times in our organization, accommodations for staff may have been granted or denied based on the fact that we had a health and safety plan that in essence called for 6-foot social distancing. And so, for example, we may have denied a request for an individual because we said, well, actually we provide, or we secure 6-foot social distancing between staff and students. And so therefore we may have denied an additional accommodation request. Another consideration is the availability of vaccines, and I appreciate the parent who shared earlier that certainly there has been a lot of commentary on the vaccination rollout process, and we recognize that in Pennsylvania we are still working through that 1A phase, and our educators are part of 1B phase. I know that in the last board meeting I provided an update that our administrative team is really trying, continues to reach out to the health networks, local pharmacies, and again, it really comes down to that availability of vaccines. We have had preliminary discussions with medical professionals on our health and safety task force, and as well as some of our leadership teams within the district. And as I outlined in my communication to families, we do see the value in surveying our families to determine the number of students who would choose either full 5-day remote instruction, a full 5-day in-person instructional option, or a full remote model for the remainder of the school year. Our rationale, as I articulated in the letter, was to wait until we see Lehigh County in a moderate level of spread. Again, reminding everyone right now, based on COVID case data, we are in substantial. And really that comes from a place of believing that we want our families to commit to a learning model at a time when the environmental conditions are more indicative of the situation in which their students will be returning. And so in particular, we found that parents naturally may change their mind as environmental conditions change. And so we were just trying to do our very best effort to survey families one time to get their perception, their preferences in terms of learning model. Because as you can appreciate, that data then is really important to us in terms of gaming out or working through potential plans that are feasible for us. We will continue to analyze our classroom capacity calculations. Back in our July board meeting, we were very transparent in terms of how we made those calculations. We even shared as part of a public presentation our approximate or our average classroom capacities at both 3 to 6 feet, as well as 6 feet social distancing. And I have some of our team members who are going to speak a bit just in terms of what our classroom capacities look like right now at 6 foot social distancing. Because as a parent of students in our school district, I certainly recognize that our kids come home and talk about numbers of students in their classes. And I appreciate that at the high school level, students are accurately reporting that in many classes, we have far fewer students than what our elementary students are reporting. And so Ms. Whitman and Mr. Povolitis are just going to provide you with a snapshot in terms of what the 6-foot social distancing and class capacities look like right now at the elementary and secondary level. And hopefully that gives you, again, just a little bit more information in terms of some of the dilemmas that we have to consider as we look to bring back more students.
So in most of our secondary departments, average classroom capacity at 6-foot social distance is less than 15 students across secondary. We are using cafeterias and alternate spaces like gymnasiums to serve 3 to 4 lunches in each of our buildings with that same distancing. At Emmaus High School, a building that was at capacity based on enrollment before the pandemic, there are 35 classrooms with a capacity of 12 students or less. There are similar anomaly classrooms in both of our middle schools, but not as many as EHS. Currently, there are 814 students at EHS attending one of the hybrid shifts. It's roughly 70% remote. At IR, 58% of the students are hybrid and 42% are remote. And at LMMS, 55% of students are hybrid and 45% are remote. If we combine the middle school hybrid shifts at either middle school into one 5-day group of students, we would exceed the 50% building capacity at 6 foot. And so, Doug, I'll kick it to you for elementary.
Sounds good. So the same at the elementary level, we took a look at all the grade levels, in particular, our youngest learners. And so we're about 74% hybrid at the elementary level overall. If we look at just kindergarten alone, again, we've looked at all of them, but if we look at kindergarten alone, we have 20 hybrid sections of kindergarten. If we would bring just the students that are currently in the hybrid model, just using that, bring those students in 5 days a week, there would actually be 2 classrooms we could just fit with 6 feet of social distancing. And there would be 18 classrooms that would not be able to meet that required 6 foot that's currently in our health and safety plan. And so we would either need to hire 18 teachers to cover that, and then of course find room for them, which of course is really unrealistic, or you have to change the social distancing. And so looking at the 6 foot, that's just one example of one grade level and the difficulty there that we would have to meet that requirement of 6 feet. So overall, that's just kind of gives you a sense of one grade level. And of course, as we move through, it's very similar to the other grade levels as well at the elementary level.
I appreciate, thank you both. And I want to say as well that we appreciate the level of community support and feedback that we've received in terms of creative suggestions as to how we might navigate some of these obstacles right now. In particular, as we look to find ways in which we can safely offer 5-day-a-week instruction, whether it's for specific groups of students or certain grade level bands. In particular, some of those creative solutions that community members have offered. I just mentioned again that we too have, not only back in July, but ongoing throughout the year, have considered some of those options. In particular, there were some solutions that suggested hiring additional staff. And again, if we maintain 6 foot social distancing, Mr. Povolitis gave you a snapshot of the implications of additional staff we would need at just one grade level. In terms of spaces, I will share that certainly we recognize that currently at the elementary level, I think we have 29 sections of remote teachers. And so, yes, we have discussed the fact that throughout our district, we have the potential in which we could move those 29 teachers if they are currently in a full-size classroom. I will point out that actually we've already moved some of them so that we could use their classroom as a larger classroom space in some buildings. But we recognize that we potentially have some flexibility in terms of elementary classrooms. But again, you also just heard we have about 29 remote teachers if we would shift them to an alternate instructional space and use their classrooms. And in just one grade level, if we would maintain 6 feet social distancing, we would potentially need 18 of those rooms just for one grade level. We've also considered options such as portable classrooms. I will say there are, in working with Mr. Anushko from facilities, there is certainly a lead time in terms of permits, as well as an install and monthly rental fee that is approximately $30,000. Again, that's a ballpark figure. So I just, again, can't emphasize enough that our intention in sharing this level of detail this evening is truly not to give excuses as much as it is to give you insight to the obstacles that we, through which we have to work. In particular, I think two of the key ones you probably heard us reiterate multiple times are the commitment currently to 6-foot social distancing and the instructional model recommendations at both the substantial and the moderate level of spread. And again, not to paint a picture of excuses of why we can't, but hopefully to just give some clarity as to maybe how these factors might vary from one organization to another, and why maybe some districts don't have to necessarily have all those same considerations that we do. Having said all that, I assure you we are a team of problem solvers, and continue to remain committed to addressing the social, emotional, and academic needs of our students, while again, also being committed to addressing the health and safety needs of our entire school community. And so certainly as we continue to meet as a health and safety task force, as well as in other groups, we can continue to bring you additional feedback. And that's my update. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Campbell. Are there any questions? Dr. Munson. You're on mute, Dr. Munson.
Thank you. Thank you for the update and some of that information. I had a question that goes back to some data that Mr. Anushko gave us this past summer, but I know sort of as the science of COVID has advanced, the focus on transmission has really changed from surfaces, contaminated surfaces, to the fact that it's airborne and ventilation and so forth. And I'm curious, sort of what does the ventilation capacity of our buildings look like right now? And is there any room for increasing that ventilation? I guess that's the first question. And then the second question is, do we have buildings or rooms in which the windows cannot be opened?
Regarding the capacity to increase the airflow in certain sections of the buildings were designed, of course, to indoor air quality controls at the time that they were designed. So if you look at most of our buildings, they were renovated in the 1990s. So that is the indoor air quality standard that they are currently meeting. And a lot of the rooms have univents. They don't have a central air handler supplying the air to them. So the univents are a much smaller unit, and you really cannot increase the CFM through them or really change a lot of the dynamics on how they handle the air and how it circulates throughout the room without some major renovations. As far as the second question was what?
About whether or not you can increase ventilation the old-fashioned way by opening windows, and what buildings is that possible?
I believe that we can open windows in every building but Willow Lane. I think that is the one building that has no operating windows in it.
Okay. My other question is about the health and safety task force. How often is that meeting, and sort of has the advice of the medical professionals on that task force sort of changed over the last sort of weeks or months?
I can speak to that. the Health and Safety Task Force meets monthly, maybe once every 2 months, depending on need. And the medical experts on the team do consistently reinforce the 6 feet of social distancing at this point in time.
Okay. I actually had 2 other questions, but I can't think of them now. So I'm going to turn it over to others, and I'll raise my hand again if I can get back to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Munson. Ms. Bowman.
Thank you. I just want to thank you for offering so much information to the public. I think on some level, some of what you shared might not be what some people want to hear, but at the same time, it allows the public to be a part of the conversation, to understand what all the complications are, and to know that the district and administration are working as hard as you can to find solutions. I only had one question, and that was about the survey when you send it out, when we go to moderate spread. How long does it take after you get the survey results to make plans? What's the time frame of that?
I think in terms of certainly we would want to be able to coordinate with our health and safety task force as well. So it's more about coordination of various groups that are involved in that decision-making process. Is that your question in terms of like how long it could take to shift a model, if that were the recommendation?
It seemed we heard from a number of parents who were expressing some anxiety that we were waiting to send out a survey. And I understand your reasons that you want to send it out very close to the time that you might be shifting the model so that people don't change their minds about which model they want. But how long what do you think the time frame is from surveying parents about the model that they want and actually changing the model? Like how much planning goes into that?
And feel free, other members of my team, to jump in if you have a timeline. I will say in terms of the process that we've talked about and what we've followed before, having surveyed community before, it really is about being able to identify potential grade level bands in which we can safely return students according to whatever social distancing guideline has, for example, right now at 6 feet. If there are discussions or conversations in the future that make adjustments to that, then that would be the data that we would analyze. We would then also have to work with our transportation provider. We would work with our building leaders in terms of reallocating classrooms. Obviously working with parents then in terms of communication and wanting to give them at least maybe like a 2-week lead time of a change.
Only thing I was going to add is that secondary, I mean, we're going to do everything we can to keep kids in the schedules they have. So as we game that out with the class rosters, then we have to look at the student schedules and the numbers in each of those social distancing scenarios.
I would just
Thank
add
you.
at the elementary level, I mean, the hopes would be to keep students in with their current teacher. That would be a big shift and change for students. And so to do, I mean, there's different scenarios that we've looked at. If you're going to hire a bunch of teachers, you would then have to switch students, and that would take a little bit more time. If we'd be able to bring all students back in, let's like hybrid A, hybrid B together into that classroom, that could be done more efficiently.
Thank you, Ms. Thank you, Ms. Bowman. Mr. Smith?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bucker. Thank you, Mrs. Campbell, as well, for the detailed update for us all. I think it's something that we all definitely needed to hear, both us and the community. It's been a pretty eventful couple of weeks since your last update and our last board meeting. Since we last met as a board, the CDC and the DOE both released their most comprehensive reports to date with regard to the safe reopening of schools. I found them to be an easy read, and I broke down on my social media page a lot of the highlights and takeaways for anybody who might be interested in reading some of those. Both reports are also available to read there for anybody interested in digging into the details. But the reason why I mentioned those is because both reports provided me with quite a bit of food for thought as it relates to tonight's discussion. So I'm glad we're able to have the discussion tonight. I'd also like to thank you for your communication to the district's families, as it provided us a glimpse of where we are currently and what the next steps might be. All of us here have certainly heard from more than a few families who are interested in knowing a bit more. And you spoke to the rationale for the timeline and releasing the survey. While I understand the rationale, it makes sense. I'd like you to and the team to consider releasing that a bit earlier, especially with some of the feedback that we just heard from Mr. Fisher. I feel like what school looks like right now for our families is a little bit of a known commodity. We know what we have and what we don't have. Families, for the most part, are probably able to create a routine, hopefully, that kind of gets them through day to day as best they possibly can. And I think that if we present them with the idea of what moderate spread might look like, or it might feel like, I think we kind of know what that's going to be like. So the more that we can give ourselves some advance notice of numbers of who might be interested in full 5-day, who might be interested in staying in virtual, and I think that parents would be able to make that decision now just as easily as they could as soon as possible when moved to moderate spread. I don't want to jinx anything by putting a timeline on that, but as soon as that happens, I think that parents would be just as easily able to make that decision now. So that's my thoughts on that. I did have a couple other questions that, as you and the Health and Safety Task Force are looking at the updated reports from the last week and having discussions after the meeting tonight, and a couple of things that I wanted to ask you questions on, and if you don't have an answer tonight, that's fine, but something to at least take back to the Health and Safety Task Force. The first question I had was related to the increased layers of mitigation that were reported, detailed in the CDC and the DOE reports. They specifically, the one that jumped out at me is the one that I had not heard of many places doing, and it was the benefits of increased screening of everybody that goes into the physical school. The report seemed to note that there's an especially strong benefit for students at the high school level who, under the report, otherwise without that layer of that mitigation layer of the added screening, would not be able to, were not recommended to attend anything other than fully virtual at the highest levels of community transmission. So if that is something that we could explore further, I had sent some information to you on how to go about doing that, or the screening itself. That would be a good thing to look into. At this point, and this is my first question, at this point, have we had any conversations or any initial impressions about that particular layer of mitigation?
I did speak with the doctor on our Health and Safety Task Force just about that screening. Of course, that's something that would have to be looked into more, but just the thousands of students and the screening and the staff and the amount of time, it seemed a little overwhelming. And of course, just looking into, availability, of testing and what that screening would look like. And so, yes, we've had initial conversations, but nothing to the point of like a finalized plan. More to, these are a lot of obstacles and things to think through, and to actually make it work. But yes, we'll continue those conversations.
Right, thank you. My next question, and this is highlighted in the DOE report, highlighted the challenges faced by our most at-risk learners. we heard a lot about the obstacles we are facing with regard to the distancing and 6 feet. The next couple of questions that I had were relating to hybrid instruction, but the first one specifically relating to at-risk learners. If we can start to bring one student back who otherwise was not able to come back, then I think that this conversation would have been considered a success. So I'm trying to ask questions that would get us to a point where we can just add as many students back in that truly need it. And the neediest students is where the DOE report suggested we start first. So my question is it possible, and is it possible to have all students with IEPs and students who come from limited English proficiency, is there any way we can get them back to full 5 days of instruction first? And the reason why I asked that is not only is it because it's identified as a great starting point, it's a need for those families and for those students, because the students that are currently now in the hybrid mode with those types of identifications, I'm hearing that several families find the asynchronous days, especially at the elementary level, to be incredibly difficult to manage on their end at home. So I'll just stop there and listen to your thoughts for now.
So good evening, everyone. I appreciate your question, and I want to say from the onset of this school year, we have really looked critically at our students with disabilities. And so in our health and safety plan from the beginning, we brought students in with the most significant needs. And that has then transformed into, we've had a lot of parent requests with regard to parents that said their students were unsuccessful. They were struggling with mental health issues. They had attention deficit disorder, and that platform of hybrid was not working for them. And so what we did was we held IEP meetings, we critically looked at the requests, and we brought those students in 5 days a week. So we have been addressing parent concerns. I continue to address parent concerns. As far as globally bringing everyone back, we did talk about that as a team early on. And again, we're facing the same issues that we're facing with bringing everyone back 5 days a week. So we have to, look at classroom, 6 foot distancing, K to 12. And so if we say we're bringing everyone back within our special ed population, it may not work. And so I don't know if Mrs. Campbell shared a chart with you that I kind of developed, and I had looked at all of the students that were identified as special ed for the specific buildings and the amounts of students that were coming in 5 days a week. So you would see, and I can certainly share that with you, that in some buildings, for example, Albertus, we have 43 students with special needs, and there's only 1 student that's coming in 5 days a week. So potentially we could bring more students in. But again, we can evaluate that. I can work with Mrs. Whitman and Mr. Povolitis to examine, our current classroom situations to determine if we could bring more students back. And there's nothing more than I would want to do that. So
I totally understand, and I thank you for considering that and adding that to your list of things to discuss in the next task force get together. The next question that I had was related to the general ed hybrid model. It was one of the reasons why I originally voted against the plan back in, I think it was December, just because it didn't have the level of consistency that kids need. one of the things that I'm hearing again with relating is relating to the asynchronous days, especially at the elementary level. And I was wondering if it was possible, if we could ask our elementary folks to consider moving their hybrid instruction to a fully synchronous live stream type of model, like is currently taking place at the secondary level. It would make for a easier, one less thing to plan for on the part of the teachers and only planning for one mode of instruction. And it would also ensure that the students who may be at home on those days are receiving the same instruction, just in a physically different environment. If that was something that we could look into, I think it would be greatly appreciated, because right now it's from my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that it is really up to the teacher to decide if that is something that they are comfortable implementing in their classroom, which is leading to a little bit of kind of a luck of the draw, and you know, who is able to provide that and who is not. So that's something we could discuss, and you know, in those conversations, that would be terrific as well. And the last question that I had is a really simple one with regard to any potential way to expand that synchronous instruction, is related to technology and bandwidth in our schools. Do we have the bandwidth within our schools to support all of our teachers streaming instruction simultaneously? It's already happening at the secondary level, but really specifically at the elementary level.
Hi, we do have the bandwidth to sustain that type of instruction. We've been working with teachers to make sure that their devices are ready. So some of them need updates and those types of things, but we ran a report with the IU today, and we're seeing that our bandwidth usage is between 10 and 15% on a daily basis. So that's been over the course of the entire school year. So that's the normal rate that it's been at. So it's pretty standard. So we definitely, after we did that upgrade a few years ago, we have, I think, about 655 access points within our schools, and each one of those can hold up to 200 clients.
Great, terrific. That's everything I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Winch?
Thank you so much for bringing out so much information and transparency to not only the board, but to our families and staff that is watching. I think we all heard some really critical information. I also want to say thank you to Dr. Picaric for something I learned just a few moments ago. I didn't realize that you were bringing back families that were struggling, and I'm so thankful that you are. And I think that, you know, as a district, and even in the CDC, there is a thread of equity that goes through the whole document, stressing the need for equity for our most challenged learners and kids that really need to be face-to-face. And whatever we can do to bring those learners and prioritize them, bring them back into 5 days a week, I think that's critical for our district. And I hope that we continue to prioritize them as we look, you know, as we move forward a safe reopening. I also think a parent survey is very critical, and I'm hoping that there's a way to categorize those parent surveys so we know which families are reporting that are in a struggle situation, those high needs learners. So I'm hoping that there's a way to identify them. There was one of the things I wanted to mention that I thought would be a good idea, and I know that there is a lack of vaccine in the area, but I do know that there are some staff members that have already received a vaccine. Excuse me. And I think it would be wise, and or a goal, or just to have a visual on how many are really getting these vaccinations, so that we know as we're making decisions, oh, if we got 75% of our staff vaccinated, that might make us all feel a little bit differently about how we make decisions. And I know it might not turn around immediately, but I think that it's a good thing to keep an eye on. And I have one last thing. Everybody has added a lot of really great questions, but I wanted to thank you again for the mental health symposium. That was really beautifully done. And I only wonder why we can't have it on as a permanent resources, either on our YouTube page or on our website. Is there a reason that we only give it a short amount of time? I think there's a lot of information on there to digest in just 1 week. And I think parents could really utilize that for an extended period of time.
I can take the request back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Witch. Mr. Champagne.
Yes, just real quick. Again, thank you, Mrs. Campbell, Mr. Povolitis, and Ms. Whitman for the update. I was one question I had regarding, how quickly we can move back to full-time instruction if we decide that that is warranted and we meet the health and safety plan criteria. You said it would take approximately 2 weeks. You'd like to give the parents 2 weeks notice, but in addition, you also talked about needing to meet with the Health and Safety Advisory Committee, meet internally to, strategize on how you're going to bring those students back. So now we're, potentially talking more than 2 weeks time frame, and I'm concerned that that is a substantial amount of time necessary if we make that decision to move in a particular direction or revise our instructional mode. And I would just hope that we can look for ways to move as quickly as prudent to get a decision made if we go down that path. So I would advocate for doing anything in looking at things now that we can, and if that means including the survey being released sooner, so that we are prepared as quickly as possible if we do believe it is in our best interest to move in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Champagne. Dr. Munson.
Yes, thank you. So just as a comment, I would echo what Mr. Champagne just said about not just the survey, but overall, I do think that we need to get more nimble. And we've all known this since the beginning, that the situation is always changing and so forth. And so the more that can be done to be able to quickly adapt to changes, I think is a positive thing for everyone in the community. I did get my act together and with my notes and my questions. And so I wanted to follow up on those. One actually was already asked by Mr. Smith, but I sort of had a further question about sort of, is there a way that we can, if we're prioritizing, and I think we ought to prioritize those students who are most in need of 5-day-a-week instruction, if we are already doing that, and if we have increased the numbers of people who were able to accommodate for that, are there further accommodations that we can make by adjusting where some of these students are in buildings and so forth, so that we're essentially matching supply and demand rather than always trying to fit a square peg in a round hole and thus forth, and so forth. And I'm thinking of what is inspiring this follow-up question is Dr. Pekarik's point, example that there's one class where there's one such student. I know that we've changed the way students are distributed at the elementary level to accommodate the remote versus hybrid. Can we do the same thing for some of these students at high need, sort of change their distribution so that we can accommodate more of them?
So I can jump in and then Linda, please. Well, Linda, you go first and I'll explain the scheduling ramifications if you don't touch on it.
So I was just going to say, if we're changing where students receive their education, is that what you're saying, building wise, moving students to another building?
I'm saying that among other options that would be within building, that is sort of juggling students and instruction to sort of maximize the number of students who are most at need that can receive 5 days a week instruction.
So far we have been able to accommodate everyone's request for 5 days a week. And so whether that be, example at IRE. So we had a student that one class was overloaded by moving that student into the class. And so we arranged for that student to go to another location to take that course. So we are kind of working out the logistics as they come up, but so far we have not had any opportunity or reason to move students from different buildings. And I recognize what you're saying. If we're going to say, let's bring the entire special ed population back, how can we do that? And can we do it safely? And do we have to move students to different locations throughout the district? So, you know, we will certainly examine that.
And the only thing I was going to add in is just at this point in the year, again, to like blow up a student schedule or revise an IEP at this stage of the game for a radical change in placement, we are trying to avoid that. So there's something to be said too for the consistency of what they have right now over a complete and radical shift in what coursework they're able to participate in based on accommodating that 5 day. So everything we've done so far has allowed us to keep them right where they are.
Great. No, I mean, I understand. I understand why you want to do that for all kinds of reasons. But, you know, as you know, there are families that there are students who have an extraordinary amount of need, and we just want to make sure that if meeting their need is better done by blowing up their schedule, that's at least something that can be looked at. That, right, like we've got the facilities to sort of think through that, I think is probably beneficial. My other question actually has to do, it's related to this changing time thing, which is that, can you give a sense of the proportion of families that are changing their requests, that are changing their desired mode of instruction on a daily or a weekly or a monthly basis? I mean, not that one family is doing it every week, but sort of each week, or, you know, what is the quantity of changers that the district is having to accommodate on a regular basis?
So I can speak to secondary, and I was going to answer that in terms of what ramifications this has with the survey. So we allow students to change every 3 weeks, and we're still doing that at the secondary level. I think in maximum periods of time, we were seeing 50 go, change placement. So obviously when we had the spike, we were seeing a lot of movement go to remote, and now we're seeing movement come back to hybrid. But again, what we're saying then through this survey, when we get to moderate, is we're asking families to then commit for the remainder of the school year. And that is a significant commitment in those conditions. So they would commit to being remote or hybrid for that remainder of the year.
At the elementary level, as you know, we committed to 3 weeks for several weeks up through December, that parents and families could make a change every 3 weeks. To answer your question, we range from 20 students to 50 students changing. We then, as we reached out and communicated to the board and the community, we made a change to that because we found that it really was not good for kids or for teachers, and really asked people to make a commitment up until the marking period, the trimester at the elementary level. So the next switch date, the deadline is March 3rd to start the trimester, which will be March 11th. We already have a waiting list that I think last time I looked is about 20 students on there. Similar to what Ms. Whitman said, we've had a range depending on how the community went, where students were going back to hybrid earlier on in the year. And then right around, December timeframe, it really jumped to now students going more remote. And at this point in time, when I look onto the waiting list for March, there are some going to remote, but the majority are moving back to hybrid. So I hope that answers what you're asking.
Yeah, I was trying to get a sense of the scope of change, and what I hear is between the two of you, we're talking about anywhere between about 40 and 100 students in the district each of these times, sort of 20 to 50 at each level, and they're moving in various directions based. The trends are based largely on the larger trends of community spread. Is that a fair summary of? Yeah. Okay. So then the other question, and it sort of connects the details that Mrs. Campbell gave about the various options that have been gamed out by the district with the budget discussion of ESSER earlier. I'm curious if the district has looked into doing surveillance testing of students and staff through a private provider in the way that some private schools and so forth have done in order to maximize both safety and the number of people that they can accommodate. And if you haven't looked into that, would it be possible to look at the ways in which ESSER funds might be spent in order to do that?
Sure, it's something we can look into.
Yeah, I'll say we have not, and certainly we can investigate the financial cost as well as the time costs of implementation. But absolutely.
That's great, and I know that I know that the costs in both are substantial, but we're looking for substantial. We're trying to fix a substantial issue, so I would appreciate if you could look into the feasibility of that. Thank you. That's all I have, Dr. Bacher. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Munson. Mr. Jankowski.
Thank you. And thank you, Mrs. Campbell and Mr. Povolitis and Ms. Whitman. I think the more communication we can have with our community, the better, to keep them advised of, what the administration is thinking and what they're doing. One of my questions, there's information out there. I'm not a doctor. I don't know how reputable it is, but I hear information about how the younger kids aren't prone to spread, and their exposure isn't necessarily leading to symptoms. Are we looking, is the task force looking into other, beyond just the doctors on the task force, but beyond that, as to the feasibility of bringing in maybe, K through 2 or K through 3 or some subset of elementary even students into a 5-day a week situation, where to give these students an opportunity that might not be as dangerous as others, and and even if it might be for 1 month or 2 months of the school year, as we as the school year is getting shorter and shorter, but just there's various reports. I mean, are we looking into various opportunities for some subsets of the students to give some an opportunity to be in school?
So when we looked at the K1 and 2 numbers, the 6 feet of social distancing is the main barrier as to why we couldn't do that, because it would be in violation of the current health and safety plan. But it was discussed. We've looked at numbers. We looked at how many hybrid students do we have. It's absolutely something, as we stated before, the Health and Safety Task Force meeting tomorrow, we can bring that up and have the conversations about that. But, the main issue there would be, we cannot violate board approved health and safety plan at this point in time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jankowski. I assume, Ms. Winch, your hand is still up from before. You don't have for it? Okay. I would just like to thank you, Mrs. Campbell, and your team for a in-depth discussion of some of the issues with this topic. And I'd leave with one comment, perhaps on this question of the survey. When I was listening to the discussion, I understand that for the final detailed planning, you need to know which families are planning to do what with which class and which schedule, but perhaps at a high level, you could look back at what proportion of families or students were hybrid and completely virtual the last time we were in moderate spread, to just get a rough estimate of what we might expect in terms of numbers at each grade level. And that might be a way to, in effect, do some things in parallel. Just have an idea where we might stand once we get to moderate and do the survey. So I have nothing more, and just thank you for your report. Moving on to personnel items, there is a correction in section 4 of the report. Wendy Arner, health room nurse, is scheduled for 29 hours and not the 35 hours a week as listed in the agenda item. With that change, I'll entertain a motion for personnel items.
So moved, Bowman.
Second, Munson.
Naomi Winch.
Is there any discussion? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Winch,
Aye.
Ms. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to business operations. Item G is for information only. So I'll take, if there are no objections, entertain a motion for taking items A through F together.
Champagne, so moved.
Second, Bowman.
Is there any discussion? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please? Oh, wait, sorry. I'm sorry. Dr. Levinson.
Oh, Dr.
Yes.
Levinson has his hands up.
Thank you. I have one comment and a question. I'd first like to recognize the generosity of the initial contribution to create the Craig James Solomon Scholarship Fund. I think this is a great way to honor the memory of a student whose time came all too soon. And it's nice to see that this is just an initial contribution and is going to be added to in the future so that it can be sustaining so we can keep his memory. And I have a question about item F, the award of the contract for the roof replacement. The cost is $475K. I was just curious how that compared to the original budgetary number, out of curiosity.
The original budget number was 632,700.
Okay, so we actually did better there, so that's great. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levinson. Mr. Byrd?
Yes, I have a question on also the roof replacement, the bid for the roofing. I want to know what the associated metal wall panels are. $124,000.
I'm sorry, you want to know about the metal wall panels as far as dollar value?
No, what does that entail? What does that mean? Normally we see roofing, we don't see that with roof replacements.
No, if you would look at Shoemaker Elementary School, the roof that is above the cafeteria or multi-purpose area has side panels on it that are not flat wall panels. They're more at an angle, so they're somewhat considered a roof panel. And then on top of that, they have the regular built-up roof on top of that. So the wall panels are around a mechanical room that sits above the cafeteria.
Is that the only place that will be, when we do replace a roof, that we will have to look at that? Or in other places in the building that we have that problem?
That is the only place in Shoemaker that we'd have to use that type of material.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd. Seeing no further questions, Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Miss Winch,
Aye.
Miss Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion's pass.
Dr. Bacher, if I could just, I apologize for interrupting, but on behalf of administration, I wanted to echo a similar sentiment to what Dr. Levinson did in terms of expressing our appreciation for the generous donation that will go towards a memorial fund and eventually become a scholarship for a graduating Emmaus High School senior. And just really, again, appreciate the generous donation and think it's a special way to honor an incredibly special young man that Craig Solomon was. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to curriculum. Do you want to say, Campbell, do you want to say any more words before I open it up for the board to ask questions, if there are any?
With regard to calendar,
Yes.
we, as always, we take the feedback that we receive from the board, as well as we have some different ways in which we receive public feedback as well, and attempt to provide a rationale as to why changes may or may not have been made. But Mr. Povolitis, correct me if I'm wrong, is this iteration of the draft similar to the first one as well? Did we make any changes?
Yeah, it's very similar to the first one. We did look at the colors and tried to hope to make adjustments there so that you could differentiate between the colors a little better.
Then I'll open it up to the board if there are any further comments or questions about the calendar. Seeing none, then we will continue to policy. I'll entertain a motion for the third review and adoption of the policies in the exhibit.
Levinson.
Jankowski, so moved.
Second, Byrd.
Are there any comments? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Miss Winch,
Aye.
Miss Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to other educational entities, we have a number of budgets to review and approve. So I'll entertain a motion for each and then ask the person that would normally give the update to provide some comments or overview before we discuss and vote on them. So starting off with the CLIU budget, I'll entertain a motion for that.
So moved, Bowman.
Second, Champagne.
Second, Champagne. Mr. Champagne, would you like to make a few comments on the budget?
I think you want.
That'd be
Oh,
Miss
I'm sorry, Ms. Bowman. Sorry.
It's okay. I mean,
I can,
Mr.
but I don't think
Champagne
you'll
can
help.
do it if he wants. He just won't know any of the numbers.
Sorry,
So it was it's a 3.2 million budget. Of that, the sending districts pay about 819,000 of it, and East Penn's portion is $140,000 or and $50. Sorry, that's a 0% increase. They've kept our contributions steady year after year for quite a long time. Overall, I'm sorry, it's a 0% increase to the sending districts, but the overall budget increased by about $94,000, which was mostly salary and benefits.
Thank you, Ms. Bowman. Are there any questions for Ms. Bowman before we vote, or any comments on the motion? Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Winch,
Aye.
Ms. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Next up, we have the Lehigh Carbon Community College budget. May I have I'll entertain a motion for that, approval of that.
Campaign, so moved.
Levinson, second.
We have our representative, Mrs. Thompson, here. I'll ask her to say a few words on the Lcti before we vote on the motion.
Thank you very much. You obviously have our wonderful budget book in a digital format, and I would think that just about any questions you might wish to ask have been answered in the booklet. The bottom line is, for the last 8 years, Lcti has not increased the amount that they've asked the school districts to provide. So that's sort of the bottom line. And as you well know, the budget is made up of 2 different pieces. There's the operating budget and the debt service lease capital budget. And when you put those 2 budgets together, what we're asking East Penn to provide is 2.2% less than last year. And the part of that reason is we're based on a 5-year average of attendance. And as you can appreciate, with all colleges, there's decreased enrollment given the current situation with the virus and obviously the financial impact of the virus. Sitting here listening to all that you've discussed related to how to deal with students, dealing with your budget, you can see that we have 17 less employees than before the COVID began. We are very careful in monitoring how things are spent, and fortunately for the community college, the monies that you were talking about with CARES, for instance, we used a significant amount of CARES money to help students maintain their status as students. And we have that same opportunity in the new monies under CRESA, that we have specific applications for students to apply. Our enrollment, like all the colleges, is going down. Lcti has been very active in retaining students and encouraging new students. Very quickly, in order to increase retention, we have success coaches, recitation coaches, and a Latinx coordinator. And we still are working on relationships with other schools that we have with 4-year colleges. We have additional agreements with Moravian, Lock Haven, Wilkes, Chestnut Hill, and more. We have over 50 transfer agreements with other schools. Personally, I would like to see East Penn as one of the schools that does the early college program with Lcti. You will recall that program as such that a student who's a good student as a junior and a senior, coordinating with the East Penn requirements to graduate and coordinating with Lcti, can graduate from East Penn as a senior and graduate from Lcti with their associate degree at the same time. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you.
Does not look like there are any questions for our representative. Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Winch,
Aye.
Ms. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Dr.
Motion.
Bacher,
Yes.
I sent you and Mr. Champagne an email. If you would contact me about that, that would be good.
Okay, I will.
Okay,
And I'd
thank
like
you.
to thank you for sitting through a rather lengthy meeting and providing a very good overview.
Actually, I used to sit through meetings that lasted till midnight, so I've dealt with this before. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you're welcome if you want to sign off or stay to the end, either way. Moving on to the LCTI, I'll entertain a motion.
So moved, Bowman.
Second, Smith.
Now I'll ask Mr. Champagne if you give an overview.
Yes, the LCTI budget is made up of two components, the general operating budget. For the 21-22 school year, the general operating budget is showing a 2% increase for a total of $28,976,100. The other component is the academic center. The 21-22 academic center budget is $2,078,200, which is roughly a 13% increase. Key drivers for both of these budgets are contractual salary increases. Healthcare benefits, as Mr. Saul had mentioned earlier, are hitting LCTI the same way they are hitting East Penn. PCER's contribution. We are seeing some offsets in the fact that we're not using equipment quite as much, so there are some reduction in equipment purchases. And another component of the academic center budget that's increasing is we're adding additional full-time staff to serve the students. The member district revenues represent about 76% of the general operating budget, and those revenues are increasing about 2.5% for the coming year. East Penn's share of the member district revenues is $2,576,349, a 4.5% increase over the past year. That's driven primarily by the number of attendees, as well as for the general operating expense portion, as well as the real estate market value in East Penn for capital cost and debt service. For the academic center, the member district revenues represent about 87% of the total budget. East Penn's share of that is $214,309, a 16.29% increase over the current year. Again, it's driven by the number of attendees, as well as the real estate market value for capital and debt service. And that's my summary. And I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Champagne. Are there any questions or comments? I like to hear that the attendance is going up, that our students are taking advantage of an excellent program at the Technical Institute. With that, Mrs. Campbell, Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Ms. Winch,
Aye.
Ms. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Motion passes. Moving on to announcements. We had an executive session before the meeting today where we discussed personnel matters, confidential matters, and safety. Our next regularly scheduled board meeting is Monday, March 8th at 7:30 p.m. And I will now entertain a motion. Oh, Mr. Champagne, you have your hand up? No? Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, I'll now entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Bowman.
Second, Smith.
Mrs. Allen, will you call the roll, please?
Ms. Bowman,
Aye.
Mr. Byrd,
Aye.
Mr. Champagne,
Aye.
Mr. Jankowski,
Aye.
Dr. Levinson,
Aye.
Dr. Munson,
Aye.
Mr. Smith,
Aye.
Ms. Winch, Dr. Bacher.
Aye.
9 ayes.
Thank you, everyone. Meeting's now adjourned.
Hey,
Good
Jane,
night.
do you want to stay on and talk to Ms.
Thank
Thompson?
you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.